starting a new series. It's called Underdogs. We're talking about people that God uses to change the world, and not just change this world, the people that God uses to impact the entire kingdom, to impact eternity. And one of the things that, as I've dug into this series for the last month, there's a pretty consistent theme all throughout the Bible, and that theme is this: that God uses people to change the world that seemingly by world standards are not the ones that we would choose. An underdog, it's people who aren't always the most qualified. It's people who aren't always the most talented. It's people who have to battle through issues. It's people like all of us. God uses people like us to change the world. I believe in a very simple process to life change. I believe it revolves around four things. I think that we make it so difficult, but I believe that there are four things. It's a process to life change. I believe that you need to know Christ. I think that's first and foremost. Know Christ changes your life. I think that you need to surround yourself with quality people. We do that through groups and Sunday morning groups and men's groups and SOT and women's groups. I believe that you should find purpose. Each of you is created for impact, and you have a talent and a gift. And if you begin to walk in that, you begin to serve something greater than yourself. And then I believe that you can tell your story and invite other people to the life-saving power of Jesus. It's what I call the process. It's a very simple process, but it's one we often overlook. And you guys hear me say this all the time. You were created for impact. And many of you in here today would tell me this. I know you keep saying that, but truth is, I'm not talented. I can't sing. I can't speak. I can't. But I'm going to tell you something. God uses people, and he has used it over and over and over all throughout the Bible. God continues to use people that by world standards seem on the outside like they don't have what it takes. But what God knows is he put them in a place for a time such as this. And here's the deal. If you're in here today and you feel unqualified, you're in a room full of people who have felt the same way. All of us, I believe, at some point have felt like we didn't measure up, like we didn't have what it takes. Maybe you've applied for a job and they've told you, well, you know, we're going to pass right now. Or maybe you've applied for school and they said, well, you know what, your grades aren't quite good enough yet. You've been passed over. You've been turned down. You weren't picked on the team in grade school. You were maybe the last person picked. Or you tried to sing and everybody cringed. You know, for all of us, there's been a point in our life when we felt like an underdog. As I was preparing, I got to looking at some colossal failures over time just in our world. The first one is a guy by the name of Walt Disney. I don't know if y'all have ever heard of him. He was fired from the Kansas City Star because, and I quote, he lacked imagination and had no good ideas. Jerry Seinfeld, he's one of my favorite comedians, was actually fired from a part. I don't know if you're over about 40, you might remember a show called Benson. It wasn't that great, but he was fired from a not great show. He didn't even know he was fired until he walked in and they gave him the lines, and his character wasn't even in there. They said he wasn't funny enough. Jerry Seinfeld, one of the top comedians, he was. There was a guy by the name of Michael Jordan. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He was cut from his junior high basketball team. How would you like to be the coach with that legacy? Michael Jordan. He made this statement. He said, I have missed over 9,000 shots in my career. I have lost almost 300 games. On 26 occasions, I have been entrusted to take the game-winning shot that I have missed. He said, I have failed over and over and over again in my life, and that's how I learned to succeed. Wow. When I think about that, there's a guy by the name of Henry Ford. I don't know if you've heard of him. Some of you drive some of his vehicles. He actually went bankrupt and had 5 failed businesses. There's another guy by R.H. Macy, failed 7 times. Bankruptcy. Formed the store Macy's. People over and over. Harlan Sanders, somebody I feel like God placed in my life. You may know him as the Colonel of Kentucky Fried Chicken. He actually was rejected 1,009 times because his recipe just wasn't that good. Over and over and over, we see people who have seemingly failed that wind up being huge. Einstein didn't even speak until he was 4 years old, could not read until he was 7, causing his parents and his teachers, they thought he was stupid. Einstein. Thomas Edison, you know, the guy that created all of the light bulbs, actually over 1,000 times he failed. A guy by the name of Abraham Lincoln. We have a monument of him in Washington, D.C., and he's listed as one of the greatest presidents ever. He actually went into the military as a captain and came out as a private. Now, I don't know if you know a lot about the military, but that's going the wrong direction, right? Like you want to go up, not down. He actually lost. He lost 7 times before he became president of the United States. That brought us out of one of the bloodiest conflicts ever. Over and over and over again, we see people who have failed that end up making a huge impact in the world. Underdog after underdog after underdog. And that's just in the world. When I started looking through the Bible, I started going, man, there were so many people. Even our friend Rudy, if y'all don't know the story of that guy, Rudy he had gotten out of the Navy. He was working in the shipyards. It's a very blue-collar job. His friend actually died in one of the shipyards, and he decided, I want to go make something of myself. The crazy thing about Rudy is he tried to get in. He had a lifelong dream to play for the University of Notre Dame, and he had this dream. The problem is that he weighed about $150 soaking wet, and this was at the height of Notre Dame's football. This was back when they were actually good. And he wanted to walk on, and they wouldn't even, he got denied 3 years in a row because he wasn't smart enough. His grades weren't good enough. Come to find out, he actually suffered from dyslexia. And he couldn't read because everything was backwards. And when they fixed that, he was able to get into the University of Notre Dame where he made their practice squad. And he got just the junk beat out of him for a couple of years. And finally, on his last game, the coach put him in. The stat line for Rudy, right? And I know a bunch of you are college football. You know, we got a university here that sends people to the pros constantly. We've got another university down south that sends 1 or 2 every 10 or 15 years. But we've got this, you know, this trend around here. But Rudy, his stat line was this: 2 plays, 1 sack. That's it. 2 plays, 1 sack, 1 dream accomplished. It was his dream, and he stepped out in his dream. And because he stepped out in his dream, the crazy thing is now he's a motivational speaker that travels all over the United States to teach people to chase after your dream. In the Bible, we're going to talk about a guy by the name of Gideon. He was so overwhelmed and overmatched and unqualified that God used him. He was one of the greatest leaders in Israel at a time when Israel did not have great leaders, but he was the most unseeming guy in the world. We're going to talk about Rahab. There's a lady in the Bible that God used in a big way. She was a hooker. I'm going to stop there before I go down a road, but we're going to get to that in a couple of weeks. We're going to talk about a guy by the name of David who was overlooked. He wasn't even picked for the team. He wasn't even allowed in the gym, and he came to be a man after God's own heart. We're going to talk about Paul. When you think about underdogs, you think about, well, Paul wrote most of the New Testament, right? Well, Paul had a past that he had to overcome, that when he became a Christian and started walking in the calling that God had for him, Paul wasn't the man. As a matter of fact, he had to overcome his past to become who God created him to be. This morning, we're going to look at a guy by the name of Zacchaeus. If you grew up in church, there's a little song, but we all know Zacchaeus as Zacchaeus was a wee little man and see, a bunch of y'all went to VBS growing up. We hear about Zacchaeus. Here's the crazy thing about Zacchaeus. 10 verses. It's kind of like Rudy's stat line. 2 plays, 1 sack. Zacchaeus gets 10 verses in the whole Bible. He's not even in all the Gospels. He's only found in the book of Luke. And if you got your Bibles this morning, we're going to be in Luke chapter 19. If you don't, that's cool. We're going to throw it on the screen. I use the NLT. There's an app you can get if you don't have a Bible. If you don't, hey, I want to offer. I'll go buy you one. Come find me. But you can also download. It's a free app. It's called YouVersion. You can get every translation known to man, study, devotionals, and all of that good stuff. We're going to be in 19 verse 1. So Jesus entered Jericho, and he made his way through the town. There was a man there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was one of the most influential Jews in the Roman tax collecting business. And he had become very rich. We'll get back to that in a second. He tried to get a look at Jesus, but he was too short to see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and he climbed a sycamore tree beside the road so that he could watch from there. When Jesus came by, he looked up at Zacchaeus and he called him by name. Zacchaeus, he said, quick, come down, for I must be a guest in your home today. Zacchaeus quickly climbed down the tree and he took Jesus to his house in great excitement and joy. But the crowds were displeased. He has gone to be the guest of a notorious sinner, they grumbled. Meanwhile, Zacchaeus stood there and he said to the Lord, I will give half of my wealth to the poor, Lord. And if I have overcharged people on their taxes, I will give them back 4 times as much. How many of y'all know our IRS needs to read that verse? Jesus responded, salvation has come to this home today. For this man has shown himself to be a son of Abraham, and I, the Son of Man, have come to seek and to save those who are lost. Jesus, Son of God, from heaven to earth, I came to seek and save those who were lost. Jesus gives us his mission in a nutshell in that verse right there. I came to seek and to save who? The lost. I came to seek and to save the lost. I came to seek and to save those who knew that they needed a Savior. I came to seek and to save the underdogs who are not worthy to stand before my Father in heaven. When I do these kind of character studies, as we're going to do over the next 4 weeks, one of the things I like to do is I like to break down the stories. If you're at home and you want to jump in here and break down the story, I'm going to break it down like I normally do when I do kind of my quiet time this morning. I like to look at all of the characters of the story, and I like to try to figure out in my own personal life, which one do I most represent? And there's many of these stories and many parables all through Luke. I love the book of Luke. That's where I land in my quiet time a lot, because Jesus tells stories how he talked to the people back then. And in this story, there's actually 4 different characters. And I want to talk about a few of those this morning. The first character, in my opinion, is actually the most important character of the story. It's the tree. It's the tree. And a lot of people don't think of the tree as being a character in the story, but the tree actually had one of the biggest roles of the entire story. I did a message on just the tree one time because there's so much meat in just the tree. Here's what the tree, the sycamore tree that we all kind of gloss over when we're singing the cute little song. I started studying, because I'm a geek, I started studying what the sycamore tree is. And it's actually just a fig tree, but it's a huge tree. And it's used over in the Middle East. And here's the ironic part of the tree in this story. Without the tree, would Zacchaeus have been able to see Jesus? If Zacchaeus wasn't able to see Jesus, would he have had a life-altering, not just a life-altering experience, not just an experience when he gave back all the money to the people who he made a difference with, but Zacchaeus had an eternity-changing encounter with Jesus himself, and it's because there was a tree. And see, that tree, here's the weird thing about that tree. That tree isn't even native to Israel. That tree is actually native to the land of Egypt. That tree had no business even being where it was. So think about that for a second. Think about what had to happen for that tree to create an encounter between Zacchaeus and Jesus. That tree, at some point, a bird had to come by and plant a seed into some ground that is not normal for this tree to grow and blossom. At some point, this tree began to sprout up, and it was on a major road, because the story talks about Jesus was coming into Jericho. It was on a road that was traveled. And this tree was on a road where Zacchaeus knew Jesus was coming. So this was a heavily traveled highway. Think about all the kids that walk by plants and shrubs. And if you got a flower garden at home and you got kids out in your yard, what do they like to do? They like to walk right through the middle of it. They don't walk around it. They like to go over and they like to pick it. They like to kick it. The balls get in there and they play. These guys, the fact that this tree managed to live on the side of a road, a heavily traveled highway was amazing in itself. And then this tree had to grow. And then when this tree got big enough, here's what they did with these trees. These trees were custom made because it was light wood. They would use it for wood to build. They would build houses. They would build gates to the city. Jericho is one of the most fortified cities ever created. They used the sycamore tree for wood. So the fact that all of these wars were going on, and the fact that they were building a bigger city, and nobody cut this tree down. And it was very visible. Nobody cut the tree down. So the tree was planted. It grew deep roots. God protected it. And it grew because there was a point in time that God had for this tree so that a man who couldn't see would crawl up into it and have an encounter with the Son of God. Think about that for a second. There's some of you in here this morning. You're a tree and you don't even know it. God planted you to have an encounter with somebody. In Israel, the sycamore tree actually means and symbolizes regeneration. It symbolizes new starts, fresh starts. Zacchaeus' name actually means righteous. But yet Zacchaeus was considered one of the most crooked men around. And I'm not saying all tax people are crooked. As a matter of fact, we have one that's running for tax office, and she is very nice, and she is not crooked. But by and large, the people back then were crooked because the Roman Empire, they would collect taxes. And they didn't really care what the tax collectors did as long as they got theirs. So the way tax collectors made money is that they would overcharge people. And the statement that Zacchaeus was a very rich man, you know what that means? He was very good at what he did. You know what that means? He was crooked. He was very, very crooked. But yet, the name Zacchaeus that God gave him as righteous climbed up in a sycamore tree that represented regeneration and had a life-changing experience with the Son of God. Wow. The tree was a big, stinking deal. One of the main characters of the story. The other character of the story was the crowd. There was a crowd around Jesus. 1,000 or more is what's estimated. Like, he had this big crowd. And here's the thing that I noticed about this crowd. This crowd was actually a crowd that was keeping Zacchaeus from having an encounter. The crowd was a barrier between Zacchaeus and the encounter he had with the Son of Man. Earlier in Luke, we see the crowd, and why the crowd is even there, because the crowd is following Jesus because they were just in wonder and they were in amazement. Jesus was healing people. He was touching lepers and they were healed. He was healing blind people. He was healing and doing miraculous things. Like there was a guy that he rose from the dead. The crowd was impressed with Jesus. You see, earlier in Luke, we see the crowd. Jesus heals the blind man like just a chapter above it. Jesus is walking through, and there's a blind man on the side of the road. And the blind man cries out because he can't see Jesus. Jesus asks him, he said, hey, what do you want? He goes, I want to see. And he said, by your faith, you see. And the crowd, the story talks about, if you read a little chapter above it, that the crowd was amazed and excited by what Jesus had done. The crowd was amazed and excited here. And so they had started to follow Jesus, and there was thousands of them. But then Jesus does something in this story which is still hard for us, even 2,000 years later, to grasp oftentimes. Jesus gave us a phenomenal teaching moment in this story. He hung out with a sinner. He hung out with a sinner. And when he did that, watch the crowd's reaction. The crowd, one chapter before, man, when he was doing good stuff and he was healing people, crowd was like, woo, we're with you, Jesus. But the second that Jesus actually stepped into his mission of reaching the lost, reaching the broken, reaching the most crooked dude in the city, the second that he did that, it says the crowd began to grumble. Who is this who would go into the house of a sinner? Sadly, too often, church looks like the crowd. You know, we have these great Christian cliches, and we're all like, we want to reach the lost. And then you get into a place like Memphis, and you're like, oh, you know what the lost, you know what that looks like? Oftentimes when you reach down to reach the lost and the broken and the addicted and the trafficked, you know what? That's a really dirty area. It's a really dirty area, and sometimes you have to get your hands dirty. So while on the front end, we like the bumper stickers, the truth is, oftentimes, that when somebody walks in, we grumble. What are they doing here? Not us. I feel like we do a great job. But I'm just talking about church in general, is oftentimes we, like the crowd, will be like, oh, man, can you believe they're in here? You know what I love about here is I hear a lot of that, man, can you believe they're in here? That's awesome. But far too often I've walked into places who claim to be a representative of Christ, and they're like, man, what are they doing here? Do you see what she's wearing? She got them high heels on. She's showing them shoulders. Can't be having no shoulders up in church. Man, can you believe he walked in? I saw him at the bar last week. Man, you go from the bar. We got communion, just juice. I can't believe he'd even walk in here. We don't want no drinkers in here. Man, they smoke dope. Man, they look at things on the computer. Man, do you hear him talking? Man, can you believe that person will walk in here? But Jesus, teaching moment. He didn't just say, hey, welcome. What did he do? He went to his house. He went to the house of a sinner. He went to the house of a crook. He went to the house of somebody that everybody in that city despised. He went to the house of an underdog. Who's the third character? The underdog is Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was a wee little man. I assume by that it means he was short. He's very short. He can't see over the crowd. There's a big crowd around Jesus. I can just envision Zacchaeus trying to jump up and down, trying to see Jesus. So Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and wee little man was he. He climbed up in a sycamore tree. And see, the thing I see about when Zacchaeus, the story talks about, he ran ahead of the crowd because nobody would let him in. You know that because he was supposed to be this important dude, right? And you know he's like, excuse me, pardon me. Nobody moved. Nobody liked him. Nobody moved. He was a little dude, so they didn't pay him much attention. Is there anybody in here who wasn't paid much attention? Is there anybody in here who wanted to be at the front but just couldn't seem to get there? I know for me, it was me. When I was little in the first and second grade, I had a speech impediment. And I still do. There's times when I trip over my words. There's times when I slow way down. And if there's ever two R's in a sentence or a word, I usually avoid it. Because I used to sound like Elmer Fudd. Yeah, some of y'all don't know whether to laugh at that or not, right? Because then you'd be making fun of me. But I used to say, wabbit. That wascally wabbit. And my S's would come out real weird and I couldn't talk. And I'm going to tell you something. First, second grade, it's brutal. It's brutal. Because I was removed from a class and I had to go to another class. And everybody in the middle of class would stare at me as I got up and went to another class because we didn't change classes. But I was pulled out of a class to go to a class. And it was for the class of the special kids. And I had a speech problem. Still to this day, I remember that. I remember the teasing. I remember and even like when we were talking about the underdogs we're going to talk about, even like Rudy, dyslexic. I mean, people, we label people, right? We label people. Everybody knows Zacchaeus as the wee little man. Wasn't Zacchaeus the guy who had an encounter with Jesus? Wasn't Zacchaeus who sat at the table with the Son of the Most High God? This is Zacchaeus, the short dude. He was known, even 2,000 years later, as a short dude. But he was a huge part of the character. He was a huge character in the story because the whole story revolves around Zacchaeus. And then there's Jesus, who is the story, right? There's Jesus, who's the story. There's a few things about Jesus in this story I want to kind of point out this morning. Jesus knew that Zacchaeus was in a tree. Think about that for a second. If you have 1,000 people around you, and they're all clamoring for your attention, you know they were asking questions. This was rock star Jesus. This was Jesus with with people who are pushing to the front. There was a story where he actually had to get into a boat just to separate a little bit from the crowd. This crowd was following him. They were pushed up on him. There were people, his disciples were like, excuse us, hey, stay back, step back, step back. There were people all over. There were things going on, and Jesus was talking, and Jesus was teaching. Everything, like Jesus was the most important dude around at that time. But Jesus did something which is very teachable. He was interruptible, first off. How often are we in such a hurry with the world around us that we often don't notice the people God put right in front of us? How often are so many things going on in the world that we often don't realize that God's created an encounter that'll be kingdom changing, but we're so busy, or we're so worried about bills, or we're so worried about work, or worried about school, that we don't see the person right in front of us. But Jesus, with thousands around, he noticed Zacchaeus in a tree. He noticed a short dude in a big tree. And he stopped. He didn't just see him. He saw him. And I know if it was me and I had all that going around, I'd have probably looked up and been like, what is that moron doing in a tree? But Jesus didn't. Jesus stopped. He saw him, and then he called him by name. Jesus called Zacchaeus by name. Biggest crook out there. A guy who'd been made fun of. He had short man syndrome because people made fun of him. People talk trash about him because he was a crook. He's in a tree. He just wants a glimpse of the rock star. He just wants a glimpse. You see, the crazy thing, one of Jesus' other disciples by the name of Matthew was actually a tax collector too. I often wonder if Matthew and Zacchaeus knew each other. You had to kind of think that they did, right? They probably ran in some of the same circles. I wonder if Zacchaeus knew Matthew had a life change, and because of Matthew's life change, he just wanted to get a glimpse of what it was all about. And Jesus, with everything going on, stopped, looked, called him by name. And he said, Zacchaeus, come out of the tree. And then Zacchaeus did what I would hope most of us would do. He didn't say, well, let me think about it. He didn't say, well, you know what? Jesus, I need to pray about that. When Jesus called Zacchaeus, you know what Zacchaeus did? He got out the tree immediately and without question. We see Jesus do this all throughout the New Testament. Drop your nets, follow me. What'd they do? They dropped, they followed. Zacchaeus, come out of the tree. What'd he do? He stopped, he came down. And he walked up to Jesus. And because of his obedience, he had a life-changing encounter. And you see, Jesus, he talks about, I will leave the 99 and go after the one. He talks about over and over how a lost coin, he uses stories all throughout that talk about, even with thousands around me, I'm going to go after the one. And why is that? Because I came to seek and save those who are lost. If there's one lost person, I don't just recognize, but I call them by name. I call them by name. I came to seek and save those like Zacchaeus. I came to seek and save underdogs. I came to seek and save the broken, the homeless, the dirty, the crooked, the addicted, the abused. I came to seek and save those that the rest of the world would often consider untouchable. Jesus says, I just don't just want to recognize them. I want to be a part of them. I want to get into their life. I want to go into their homes, and I want to have an encounter beyond any encounter. And Jesus showed us how it was done. He went into the streets. He didn't wait on people to come to him. He went into the home of the Zacchaeus. No boundaries. No preconditions. He didn't say, you know what, Zacchaeus, here's the deal. If you'll return the money first, then we can talk. He didn't say, you know what, Zacchaeus, if you'd have a better attitude, then we can talk. He said, Zacchaeus, come out of the tree. I want to have an encounter with him. You see, here's the deal. Jesus knew what Zacchaeus had done. He knew. Like his father planted a tree hundreds of years before the encounter because he knew there would come a moment that this man needed to encounter eternity change. He knew hundreds thousands of years ago, he orchestrated a set of events that would be an encounter like no other encounter that 2,000 years later we would still be talking about. But here's the thing, Jesus knew what he had done. Jesus knew he was a crook. It wasn't like Zacchaeus was trying to hide it. He was a tax collector. He was good at what he did. I think often we shy away because we're like, well, I don't want Jesus to know. Can I tell you something? He knows. The people who walk in the door, we may look at, he knows. He knew what Zacchaeus had done. And here's the crazy thing. Even knowing that he was one of the biggest crooks out there, you know what he did? He loved him. He loved him right where he was. No boundaries, no condition, unconditional love. And when we throw that word out in church, oftentimes like, oh, unconditional love. Unconditional love, you know what that breaks down as? Love without conditions. See, that's what seminary taught me. Love without conditions. Love without hoops to jump through. Drop your net. Drop what you're doing. Just come on. Just come to the table. Stop what you're doing. Get out of the tree. Come and have an encounter with me. Jesus loved Zacchaeus right where he was. And here's the crazy thing. This story is actually just before Jesus begins to enter into Jerusalem, just before he goes up a hill and gets nailed to a tree. You see, Jesus knew what was coming. And he wanted to stop and have an encounter because there was one. He wasn't focused on the thousands. He was focused on one. One person needed an encounter. You see in this cute little Bible story, Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he. In this cute little Bible story that we learn when we're 5, we have little dances to. In this cute little Bible story, there's a huge message. There's a huge message that in 10 little verses, Jesus taught us. He taught us how to be a world changer. He taught us how to be a world changer. You see, too often we're worried about all of this. We're worried about all this stuff. We're worried about all the lights and all the sounds and all the things that grab our attention and all the stuff. Too often we're worried about everything else. And Jesus said, hey, even with all that going on, focus on the one. Focus on the one. I came from heaven to earth. I died a brutal death for the one. I want to have an encounter with the one. Some of you in here, you're a tree. You've been in church. You were planted. So that somebody else can encounter Jesus. You see, here's the deal. When you step out and you start being a tree and you start bringing lost people to church and you start bringing people who don't really fit into church. You bring people in that they don't know John 3:16. They don't know good Father. They don't know the verse. You know why the music's so loud? Because when it stops and people finally begin to sing, we don't want them to be embarrassed because they don't know the words, because there's a place for them here. You want to know why it's dark? Because sometimes when people have tears rolling down their faces, we want an encounter between them and God. We don't want to embarrass them. Everything we do is so that people can have an encounter with God. It's not to be cool. I love the graphics. I love the lights. I love the music. But what I love more than that is when I hear stories of people having an encounter with God. And some of you, you're the tree and you were planted for that. But let me tell you, when you start to bring lost people in, it gets messy. It gets messy. They don't dress like they're supposed to. They don't talk like they're supposed to. They may open a car door and a beer can may roll across your church parking lot. They may walk in and they may smell like the night before. They may walk in clothes that are not appropriate for church, whatever that means. Can I tell you something? When you start to reach the lost, when you start to step out in the mission that Jesus called us to, not just a church, but as individuals, what you realize is that it can be a dirty world. It can be a dirty world out there. But Jesus says, I came to seek and to save the lost. I'm going to leave the 99 and I'm going to go after the one. For some of you, I want to encourage you, be the tree. Be the one that God places. There are people that He's going to intersect your life with every single day. What are you doing with that encounter? Are you helping them encounter the one who can bring life change? Or are you the crowd? Are you the one who's grumbling? Are you the one who's judging? Are you the one sitting in bitterness? Are you one that's around Jesus, but you haven't encountered Jesus? You're going through life. You're busy. You walked in here this morning, and all you can think about is what you got to do tomorrow. And we sing some songs, and we repeat some words. But let me ask you something. When was the last time you had an encounter with Jesus? That heart-bursting, arm-raising, tear-flowing encounter with the Son of God who gave you eternity. When was the last time you had that encounter? Or are we too busy with what's going on? When was the last time you had that encounter? Some of you in here today, you may be Zacchaeus. You may have walked in here and you may not know Jesus. Man, welcome. You may have walked in here from a long night last night at the bar. Welcome. You may have had your hands up here today, but you may have had your hands where they shouldn't have been all weekend. Welcome. You may have walked in here in clothes that aren't appropriate. Welcome. You may not know the songs. Welcome. I want to introduce you to the one that can change it all, and it ain't me. It ain't me. I'm as fallen and as broken as they come. I want to introduce you to the one who can give you drastic life change. Not just life change, not just world change, but eternity altering change. He can break those addictions. He can break that bitterness. He can break that unforgiveness. He can break those chains, whatever those chains are for you. He can free you from that reputation. He can free you from your past. He can free you from the abuse. See, the encounter with Jesus Christ is the encounter that can truly change your world. I want to introduce you to Him today. I've got two questions as we get ready to go into communion. I've got two questions. One, when was the last time you had an encounter with Jesus? Some of you have been in church for 40 years, and it's been 20 since you haven't. When was the last time you talked face to face with the Most High God? You see, this morning we're going to have an opportunity as we get ready to take communion, and we're going to come down and we're going to remember the sacrifice that Jesus gave. But before that, Jesus talks about, and the New Testament talks about, there should be a point in our lives before we break bread and before we drink the juice that we should clear our heart and our mind. I want to ask you this morning, is there something in your life that you need to lay down at the feet of Jesus? Is there something in your life that you can't break? Is there something in your life that you're so angry and so bitter about that you need to lay it down? Is there something in your life that you need to have an encounter with the one who can change it? I want to encourage you this morning. We created more room at the altar. We created a big old space so that you could come down and have an encounter with Christ. My second question is this. Who can you be a tree for? Maybe you're having the encounters with Christ. Let me ask you something. I want you to close your eyes for a second. I want you to pray, God, give me a name. I bet you a name pops into your head. I bet you it's a coworker. I bet you it's somebody that works for your company. I bet it's a classmate. I bet it's that lady down the street. I bet it's that grumpy old person that gets on to you all the time about your yard. I bet there's somebody in your world that God puts in your brain. And here's what He's calling you to do. Be the tree. This morning as you come to the altar, I want you to pray for that person. And I want you to ask God, this is a scary place to be, God, how can I be the tree? How can I create an encounter for them to meet you? And then walk it. So this morning as our guys come on to the front, we're going to enter into a time of communion. It's to remember the sacrifice that Jesus gave us. If you're in here this morning and you don't know Christ, I want to invite you to follow Him. It has been the single most thing in my life that totally changed the direction. like you're unqualified? Yeah, you are. So am I. So are these men right here. None of us are qualified. But Jesus came from heaven to earth to qualify us. He said, through me, you are qualified. Through the blood I shed, you're qualified. Through the beating I took, you're qualified. Give it to me. Beginning today, you can walk in newness. Beginning today, you can walk a life that you were called to walk. Beginning today, you no longer have to be an underdog because you're a son or a daughter of the Most High God.